Hi there, and thanks so much for tuning into something a little bit different again today. I know this channel primarily started off as an art channel, but over the years I got into a whole bunch of new hobbies, and in recent years modding video games has become one of them. So I wanted to share something today that I did for Cyberpunk 2077, some NPC customization with a custom mesh that I built from scratch. So kind of art adjacent still, but with a little bit of a twist. The handsome fella you're seeing here is Carrie. I'd argue he is one of the main NPCs, even though the majority of his content happens only rather late in the game. But he's still a big favorite of mine for many reasons. And actually, the way you're seeing him here didn't really exist in the game before I started this whole project, apart from one little obscure photo I found on a fan page on the internet for him in-game. The photo in question that started it all off, depicting him roughly in his 30s, I'd guess. But here on the right, as an old man, is how you primarily interact with him in-game. There are some flashbacks to his 20s and 30s where he looked more like this, but I think the photo in the middle is somewhere in between that very big time span. I should also mention that I actually worked on this whole project last year in 2025. My original incentive to get started on this being this tidbit of info on the Cyberpunk fandom wiki. Carrie is a musician and he released an album in 2025 in this setting. So, as a chronically online person, I wanted to create something for that fictional date, as a celebration, I guess, in the shape of a custom NPC appearance of him that fit that date of the album release. Finally, I also got some inspiration from these really cool pieces of concept art of Carrie, especially for some details that are too blurry in the main photo. After all references and inspiration was gathered, I put together a custom NPC appearance for Carrie. But the final key piece that was missing was a custom piece of neck cyberware, and I couldn't really put that together from any vanilla assets. I had to make it from scratch. His cyberware is basically an artificial voice box, and he still has something like it in the year 2077. But I wanted to make something a little less sleek and polished for his 2025 appearance. And I sadly did not record the whole process of modeling it in Blender, because I'm not that experienced with it yet, and I wasn't sure I wanted to even make something out of it then, out of this whole project in the form of a video or whatever. But I think no matter what you're modeling in Blender, the overall process of how to get your custom meshes into the game could still be interesting to see if you're dabbling with this. You just saw me marking a seam around my finished mesh, because as the first step for giving this textures later, I need to create a UV layout. Blender is sometimes a bit finicky with this, I haven't quite figured out yet why, but with unwrapping a mesh, so turning my 3D object into a 2D texture stencil, I always want as few big, distinct, and logically shaped islands as possible. That makes creating textures much easier. And marking a seam on the mesh before unwrapping helps Blender figure out how to ideally cut my mesh into these individual parts. What I noticed at this stage was that there were some little loose parts in my layout that I likely accidentally created at some point during the modeling. But because we don't like loose ends or holes in our 3D models, I went looking for them and deleted them all. I think they were all on the inside of the mesh and not visible anyway, so this was thankfully not a big deal. And I know I'm kind of breezing through this process a bit, but I already have an idea for a little less complex project I want to tackle soon, where I can go a little bit more into modeling and the overall process again in more detail. Yeah, it really doesn't help that it's been almost a year since I recorded all of this without any notes. I do not recommend. The red line you can see here is the seam again that I marked all around my mesh in the beginning. Like right down the middle, so the UV layout is split into an outside and an inside half. The outside part being the more interesting one in the end, because that's the one visible with the main texture on it. And the inside part will basically disappear inside of Carrie's neck if all works out as planned. It won't work out as planned, as you'll see. If you're watching this, I'm assuming you probably have some basic knowledge or at least a general interest in modding Cyberpunk or video games in general. But just in case, I'm going to say a thing or two about the tools and processes that I use, and I'll link the openly available resources in the description. For importing and exporting Cyberpunk meshes to and from Blender, you need a special plugin, for example, that just warned me that something's amiss with my mesh. I had only the 3D mesh selected when trying to export it, but you gotta make sure you also select the according armature if you want it to be able to move in-game, which I want in this case. So I had to go back and redo that and re-export it, and now we should be good. I mentioned at the start that I already built a 2025 appearance for Carrie, so that's not gonna be part of this video. I'm only adding my custom cyberware mesh as the final puzzle piece to it. For all of that, I've used WolvenKit, the main modding tool by and for fans of Cyberpunk 2077. So I already have my project and everything set up here, including a placeholder mesh that I'm now replacing with my new mesh by importing over it with the import tool. So here's my mesh. In the little preview window on the bottom, I can see that, yes, that looks like the thing I built in Blender. But now you're like, hold up, what do you mean with placeholder mesh? I thought you built this thing from scratch. Yes and no. Like I said, Carrie's normal in-game model of his 2077 appearance has a neck cyberware mesh too. So I used that as a base for my custom mesh with all its materials and internal structure, and only replaced the 3D wireframe thing with my custom model. And I also replaced the vanilla textures with placeholder textures that fit my mesh for now. If you want to set up something like this for a completely custom NPC, there goes a little bit more work into it too, because you need to rename and repath all the components, but that is potentially also a good topic for a separate video. What you need to know for now is that my 3D model itself is custom, and it's only borrowing all the surrounding structure and whatnot from a vanilla asset so that it works in-game. I set up this version of Carrie as a completely custom NPC, so I can check within WolvenKit's entity preview of him if all parts are where they should be. Emphasis on should, because in-game sometimes it looks different. So here's my custom NPC Carrie in-game, and even though my next cyberware mesh did show up properly in WolvenKit, meaning I set up my file structure correctly, it's nowhere to be seen in-game. It can be very frustrating when it happens, because that means somewhere along the line something went wrong, and you have to go hunting for errors. So what I usually do, first thing, is check WolvenKit again. My first impulse was maybe something's wrong with the texture, because like I said, I put a placeholder texture here that might just not be visible in-game. And for cross-referencing, I also look at the original 2077 mesh to compare how stuff is set up there, but I don't think that's it, actually. The next best culprit is the app file. Here, all parts of your custom character are gathered, and there's a lot of settings and adjustments possible, and a lot of room for little mistakes that cause big issues later on. But I also couldn't find anything immediately obviously wrong here either. So I decided to go back in-game and check there again, because if nothing is wrong with the structure, something could be wrong with the way I set up the mesh in Blender. And there's a little tool, ACM, Appearance Creator Mod, that lets you toggle individual parts of your characters. And here you can also see that my mesh is there in the structure, but it's not visible. So I'm thinking maybe it's there, but something is wrong with the armature or something, so that it's actually hidden inside Carrie's neck and I don't see it. So I turned off his head, which is very creepy, but as you can see, there it is, very faintly visible. So my structure and everything is correct, but something is fundamentally wrong with my mesh that I need to double check, so it's actually not back to WolvenKit, but back to Blender in the next step. Two things could be wrong, actually: the positioning of the mesh or its weights. Spoilers, it's both, but the main culprit was definitely the weights here. At that point, I did not know that yet and just checked through my whole structure first to see if anything odd struck me. But then I decided to just import Carrie's head mesh because I had originally used that as a basis for my custom mesh. So here again, you can see well that my mesh should technically fit his neck well. The problem is that what we see in Blender or what we see in the entity preview in WolvenKit does not reflect how meshes are interpreted by the game engine in-game. Something that looks right here in a static environment without any physics happening could not be working live, so to speak, because of the forces and physics applied to the object inside the game engine. I hope that makes sense. So I figured physics is probably the issue here. Some forces are or aren't applied to it, so it just remains static, but that leads to it actually not being visible whenever he moves or even when he's just standing around. The problem with me recording this voiceover like a year later now is that I don't actually recall 100% what the exact issue was, but I remember I had to compare the armature and all the little bones of my custom mesh with the head mesh, and I realized there was a discrepancy between them. My custom neck cyberware mesh was missing some bones and the weights didn't match properly, which led to the mesh not showing up in game. So what I did was delete my mesh's armature and I replaced it again with the armature from the head that I imported because I had used that as a base for it to begin with. So by the end of it, it had all of its bones again. And then I also, with a data transfer modifier, copied over all the weight information from the head mesh to the neck cyberware mesh, because the neck cyberware mesh sits very close on top of the head mesh. And it is supposed to move with the head as closely as possible, and the same physics should apply to both. That was an explanation and a half. Yeah, I'm really sorry that I can't explain it much better. At least not with that much of a gap in my memory, with that much of a time span having passed, but I can definitely show this in another video. I could do a little tutorial on how to do a data transfer because I do have that on video and I do basically know how to do that. And I think that might already be a big help in case you're ever in the situation like me where you have to fix a broken mesh like that. But this is a long video already, so back to the topic. Just like before, I re-imported my custom mesh and I'm checking again in the entity preview if everything looks okay. And again, everything looks okay. So at least I didn't break anything new, but only in-game will tell if my fix worked. I'm spawning my custom characters with AMM, Appearance Menu mod, in case you're wondering. One of my favorite mods of all time because you can do so much stuff with it. But yeah, lo and behold, my fix worked. Obviously the mesh still has only the placeholder texture, but it's showing up, so the weights were definitely broken. But as you can see, there is still a little bit of clipping going on, like the part in the center of his throat. His skin is still clipping through the mesh a little bit, and also on the edges. I could see that the mesh is kind of clipping into his neck yet, especially like when you bend his head around, you can see like on the edges, it's sitting a little too comfortably close on his neck. But that is the aforementioned position fix that is not as difficult as the weight stuff, thankfully. So that is only a minor thing and nothing too difficult. So we need to head back to Blender once more and tackle that. Overall, though, at this stage, I was super happy already that the cyberware mesh was now moving properly with his head. And now what I did next was, again, put his head in for reference, and I also imported his 2077 cyberware, kind of as a guide for me how far I needed to move my mesh to the front of his neck so it would clip a little bit less. So I'm really just very, very slightly moving it to the front. In Blender, it looks like it's way, way too far. Like, especially towards the bottom, you can see it's standing out really, really far. But I promise in the end, it's gonna look good, even if it looks horrible outside of the game for now. In real life, I probably checked back if everything looked fine now, but I'm not gonna spoiler that just yet. Though, obviously, you saw the end result in the beginning of the video already. But before we go back to look at everything in-game, I actually want to go to one of my favorite parts of this whole thing now, which is texture painting. So as you can see, I scoured the game files for this tiny little photo of roughly in his 30s Carrie. That's on his fan page on the in-game computers. To have that open as a reference for roughly how I wanted all these little golden parts to be laid out on my mesh. I also opened the textures of his 2077 Cyberware so I could go for a similar color scheme. And I went in and color picked the various gold and black tones to work with on my own textures. The video is sped up a little bit here because, as you can imagine, this was a lengthy process. And I changed details several times because I wasn't quite happy with how something looked just yet. I didn't like the overall style just yet. And I was really playing around and having a lot of fun with it. But those figuring out stages do take some time. Like I mentioned, and like you might have seen for yourselves, his 2077 Cyberware is relatively simple and sleek. And I think that also really fits him in that stage of his life where he is already this refined, well-versed, far-traveled, super successful musician. Like he's really far into his career and whatnot. So I specifically wanted to do something that contrasts with that for this piece of cyberware for him. Something not quite as refined, a little playful maybe, very, very detailed, very many fun little small pieces where I'd like to imagine some of them are probably only just decorative. Some others might be hiding little secret buttons and playthings and whatnot. Because he's still young and dumb instead of old and dumb and doesn't really know that much what he wants yet, maybe. So in the hopes of kind of reflecting that stage of his life, I'm also thinking this is probably his first piece of next cyberware he has. He doesn't really know what works well for him and what doesn't. So this is an experimenting, bold, flashy stage in comparison to the more refined one he has later in his life. Not to say the one he has in 2077 isn't bold and flashy, but in a very different way. So when I had this part done, I wanted to check how the thing as a whole looked like. And I think at this stage, I wasn't quite happy with some parts yet because it was all too many little small details. And I changed things up a little bit again, simplified here and there, and tried to the best of my ability with this very small reference image better match the vibe of that. The little net diagram thing in the background that I'm using as guidelines is the UV layout that I created in the very beginning of the video in Blender. So I just exported that as a PNG and put it as my bottommost layer in Photoshop. And I'm also trying to match the shapes that I'm drawing onto the texture to the shape of my mesh, to those triangles and lines and whatnot, to make it match the geometry of my mesh as best as I can. Like I mentioned earlier, throughout of the story of Cyberpunk 2077, you encounter Carrie in various flashbacks in different stages of his life, as well as in the present, like in the year 2077, but only in the present, he is depicted with neck cyberware. So I'd also like to imagine what happened between the years where he wasn't having any of that, and then what led to him having it installed. Was it some type of vanity? Was it performance pressure? Was it an illness even? Maybe that forced him to get that if he wanted to keep his career as a musician. It's all sorts of interesting possibilities there, and I like to think about all the implications and what's most likely and what isn't, and how any of that could also influence the appearance of this piece now. In the bottom part of the reference picture, there is this big golden area that is kind of hard to tell what it's supposed to be. But here I like to think that maybe he put very prominently his logo there, for example, because in his 30s was the stage in his life where he made it big as a solo artist. And somewhere around that time, he also had his logo. You will see it in a moment. He had his logo tattooed on his arm, for example. So I think it would make sense that if he, during that time, had that piece of cyberware installed, he probably wanted it to be branded to match that portion of his life and that start of his solo career and making it big. And what I'm doing here is also adding a little nod reference thing to his 2077 cyberware, actually. Not a part of his neck cyberware as such, but he has various pieces of cyberware installed all across his neck and chest area in 2077. Like this little round valve part that, I don't know, I kind of just like the vibe of that, and I wanted to include it as a little nod to that design in my texture, I guess. And it also fits well with the reference picture because there is some kind of roundish detail toward the side of his neck. So maybe this is a valve or a little secret button, or maybe nothing in particular that's there in that location. At this point, I've arrived at a stage where I really like the way my little gold parts are laid out. And now it's time to actually do some painting. So I just color in the base completely black. Again, like I said, I'm picking the colors from his 2077 texture to keep it all a concise look. And again, using my UV layout that I exported directly out of Blender as a guide on where to put my colors, because this is how they're going to show up in-game on the model. We're also going to look into making normal maps in a moment, which give the mesh some additional three-dimensional details that aren't included in 3D mesh itself. But yeah, like you see, I'm again working very closely with my geometry that I've made and adding little ridges and details and depth by painting my texture on as well, because that is gonna end up being the base for my normals. I'm actually not super well versed with how other video games these days set up their materials and stuff. But the way Cyberpunk's material and texture system works is also a little bit special, because we do have on the one hand these diffuse textures with like actual colors and all the little details and whatnot, but there's also materials that are set up a little bit differently, the multi-layer materials. If you're into modding Cyberpunk, you will know what I mean. If not, then this is not the topic of this video, because that's a whole other can of worms. So we're just doing a very normal, diffuse, normal map type of texture. But the little gold parts actually will have a multi-layer setup that needs to be targeted separately from what I'm doing here. But basically what I'm trying to say is it is very crucial that all these parts remain on separate layers in Photoshop. You will see I have like a shit ton of layers on the right, and that is on purpose. So I have my base, the black bit, the black underlayer, I suppose, which is like this metal plasticky texture, is its own layer. And the gold parts also need to be on their own layer because I'm gonna use these. They're gonna get assigned a special material in WolvenKit later. And I need these as a mask for the game to know where to apply the special texture. But even though they're gonna get a special shiny golden texture applied, I'm still painting in all my details here, including shading and little color hues and whatnot, because I need them for my normal map. I'm not sure if maybe I could even do this gold part in like pink or green, and it would still work with the way the texture is gonna be set up later, but just to be safe, I'm copying the look and feel of the way the 2077 texture is also set up. And it's just like this, painted in black and gold, how it should be, in case, I don't know, the shiny material is suddenly not available, so that it still has that basic appearance. You will also have noticed that I'm only working on one half of the texture. Like for the base, I only did one half and then copied it over and mirrored it. And I'm doing exactly the same until I'm happy with the look and feel of the gold parts as well. Because this is super time intensive. I actually can't tell you how long it took, but this was the part that took the longest in the whole process. I'm pretty sure it took longer than building the actual model, and I'm not that skilled in 3D modeling yet. So again, to save myself some work, and I'm so grateful digital art makes this possible so easily. I'm painting one half until I'm satisfied, and then I'm just copying it on a new layer, flipping it over, and slapping it in there again. Speaking of slapping things in there, I found Carrie's logo only in the form of this sticker and like a sticker texture in game. But it works, and since this is the only part of the whole design that's not supposed to be symmetrical, it had to wait until the very end until I could place it there. So yeah, again, I'm just doing this the simplest way possible. I'm cutting out the logo as a reference, this samurai type helmet thing. And I'm gonna trace it onto my design and then blend it into the base by adding some shading and some more details to really make it look like it's part of this golden piece of the cyberware, like some engraving, some three-dimensional emblem that stands out and is the centerpiece of it all. I just realized one other instance where his logo would probably be featured is his tattoo. but I didn't think of that when I made this. But I'm also actually not sure if the tattoo is not partially covered by some other tattoo elements. So this was the safest bet where the emblem is really featured entirely. So I can use it to trace it and make it an engraving here. But with that done, we're actually also done with the majority of the texture work, because the next thing would be setting up the normal maps. In an older version of Photoshop, there was actually a native feature to set up normal maps, which they stupidly got rid of. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the NDO Photoshop Action Preset plugin. I've linked it in the description. There is a multitude of ways to set up normal maps, I believe, but I found this one to be working quite well. Though admittedly, I don't really know what the ideal settings here are, and I did a lot of testing around and trial and error. Also, a general tip, because I'm not sure if this plugin actually merges layers or anything while it does its thing, always keep your diffuses and your normals and everything in separate files, ideally, so that you don't lose any layers that you might still need later on. Like I will now. Like I mentioned earlier, there are some materials in Cyberpunk, the multi-layer materials, that need a special setup that is different from the normal map and diffuse type structure. You will on the one hand need the special multi-layer materials, but the multi-layer materials also need multi-layer masks. And this is what I'm building here, this black and white outline-ish texture that just gives the shape of all the parts that are going to be shiny golden in my final mesh. It basically works like masks in Photoshop would also work, where all parts that are white are going to be visible and everything that's black is not going to be visible. Just visible in this case applies to the multi-layer material that's tied to my mask. I exported my texture, my normal map, and my material mask as PNGs, and I'm going to import them now individually with the appropriate settings into WolvenKit. If you stick to the game's naming conventions with your own custom files, WolvenKit is going to thank you by pre-selecting pretty reliably the correct import settings. And lastly, what I still need to do is now update my mesh with my new custom textures. So I'm going to be replacing the vanilla textures that were still in there and my placeholder textures with my new diffuse normals and mask. And then we can look at it again in game. So it seems that everything worked. My mask is applied. The base of the cyberware is black and the details are the shiny golden material that I was hoping for, similar to his necklace. And thanks to the normal map we created, we also have a lot of detail on an otherwise still very sleek and simple mesh. I realized though that the level of detail on all my little parts of the mesh seemed pretty intense. So I set up some funky lights and everything to be able to look at it better, because the lighting here in this diner where I took these pics was a bit suboptimal. Give me a second to rotate the screen so you can see this better. So the level of detail is very high, which can be good, but I found it a bit too intense for this. So basically my normal map worked a little bit too well, which is why we're looking at it in game and seeing how everything works and playing around with different lighting to get the best look possible, or the best look that I'm imagining in my head for this. And I decided, yeah, no, I think I want to rework the normals again. But overall, everything is working at least. Everything shows up, everything moves correctly. There is no intense clipping or anything like that anymore. So this is really just the final little adjustments and details to finalize this mesh. There's a lot of settings in the plugin regarding to depth and detail and whatnot. So I really just tried to go a little less intense on some of my previous settings. Like I said, it was really just a lot of playing around and trying to figure out what looks good or what might look too intense. And I went for something very, very subtle here in the hopes it would translate well into game. I still have the video sped up quite a bit, but feel free to pause at any point in time in the entire video really to have a closer look at what my settings are if you're curious. And of course, also always feel free to just ask, be it about general processes or details I just skimmed over here, for example. That helps me a lot with figuring out what people might be most interested in or what people struggle with the most. And then I can also make like a shorter video just showcasing specific details. Like I mentioned, I might just do that in general because like I have hours of footage that I could cut down into more bite-sized tips, because I think that could definitely be helpful if you're stuck with a very specific problem. But for this video here, I really wanted to show the project as a whole, the entire process, at least as far as I recorded everything, as a little documentary style video for myself to a degree, because I really, really enjoyed working on this project, and I think it would be fun to look back at it in a couple years with more knowledge and cringe at all the mistakes. But also, I think it could be useful if you're only just getting into modding, or even if you've been modding for a long while, to see a process like this in its entirety as a learning opportunity, understanding and seeing all the different steps that are necessary. At least I personally like really seeing projects like that from start to finish because it helps me understand how to tackle my own ideas. But the downside of big project videos like that is, of course, if I don't want to make a 3-hour long video, I can't go into every single detail. Speaking of every single detail, as you've seen, I've actually gone over my normal map manually in the end and smoothed out some details that I found were still a little bit too strong. And once I was happy with that final look, it went back into WolvenKit. Before we end it though, I wanted to do a final look over every step of the process, over all the final parts that this project consists of. My Blender mesh that I based off of a portion of Carrie's head mesh by taking out a little bit of his neck and then sculpting a snugly fitting 3D mesh for him like that. As you can see, it's still clipping decently with his neck here, even though it looks like it's also on the front sticking out very far, but that is necessary for it to sit snugly against his neck in game due to physics constraints and stuff. Then here we have the WolvenKit project that I also based off of his 2077 vanilla cyberware. I think it's a pretty common thing in modding that you take a vanilla asset and then change some stuff here and there, change the textures, change the mesh, change the colors, change whatever you want, change everything and just keep the very basic structure, whatever your specific project needs. We created custom textures, custom normals, custom multi-layer masks. We kept the coloring of the original and the multi-layer material of the original, the shiny, nice golden setup that we made visible with this mask, and integrated it all into a custom NPC that's spawnable with the help of appearance menu mod in-game. And then we can pose and play around with. Because in the end, that's what this is for. Obviously, modding is fun, but it's also fun to have something permanent in your game in the aftermath that you can play with, take cool photos of, because like I mentioned in the beginning, I've gathered a lot of new hobbies in the last years, and one of them is modding, another one is virtual photography, as you see in the end. So yeah, entity preview looks fine. Here's all the many, many little meshes and details that went to it. Like I said, I set this up in advance. Actually made his hair a little bit custom and made his tattoos a little bit more custom, fitting for that era of his life. And now we finally have a pretty decent looking, completely custom mesh, which moves nicely with his head, which looks nicely in different lighting, which I personally think is decently lore compatible, and gave me the opportunity to take some really cool pics for a fictional character's album release just in time for that date last year. Thanks so much for watching. Take care and always have fun creating.